This podcast is about correcting the balance, whether it's something celebrated as good when it shouldn't be, or the other way around. Or maybe the heroic tales of history just need to be knocked straight on their ass. Me, I just want to share the complete picture, because that's when this whole thing gets fun. Warning, jokes and sarcasm may ensue. Welcome to Prick the Balloon. Hi, I'm Mike Vance, and welcome to episode 18 of Prick the Balloon. You know, the tagline for this podcast, with our incredible pink balloon and a silk top hat logo that was designed by my buddy Chris White, is deflating history one prick at a time. And one particular prick was in the news recently for giving the Orange Goon $50 million. Now, first, we can never be reminded enough that the United States is the most openly corrupt country on earth. We openly allow people to do something like just hand over $50 million to someone running for office and act like that is absolutely innocent and okay and somehow fair and isn't going to have any influence over how the country is run, which bought and paid for stooges get appointed to the Supreme Court, or it certainly has nothing to do with why billionaires keep getting richer while the regular middle and lower economic groups have to keep fighting the daily slog just to afford their $39 latte at Central Perk. In other countries, pick one, I don't know, Russia, for example. You get your financing for your hotel chain, you get peed on by hookers who you think look like your daughter, and then you end up beholden to a craven genocidal dictator and allowing him to influence elections and run social media bot farms from the cart barn of a golf course in West Virginia. I mean, that's just a totally and completely hypothetical example. Anyway, this prick of whom I speak is named Timothy Mellon, and he gave us $50 million the day after Cheeto Benito was found guilty by a jury in a public trial at the state, not federal level, of 34 separate felonies. Now, it's weird, but I searched and searched other court records, and I couldn't find that Mellon gave any money at all to anyone else convicted of even a single felony that day, or even the whole week. Now, maybe he told the Orange Goon to make sure the 50 mil got spread around between Bob and Reggie and Hector and all the other minorities down at Rikers lockup. But Mellon just didn't know that the spray-tan crazy con man is in the habit of stealing from charities, not handing money out. Plus, there's the fact that this Timothy Mellon, who is 81 years old, by the way, and therefore must, by the definition of radical righties, be a doddering, out-of-touch drooler, had previously given $53 million in stock to the state of Texas to build more wall along the Mexican border. And that Mexican border is an imminent problem for Mellon because his homes are in Wyoming and Connecticut, both presumably just a day's walk from Eagle Pass. I could spend a lot more time talking about various self-entitled radical right-wing trust fund kids who were born with hundreds of millions in the bank and never did anything worthwhile on their own. The kind of people like George H.W. Bush who were completely flummoxed by supermarket scanners. But instead, I'm going to spend the time talking about their grandparents. See, old Timbo Mellon's grandfather was Andrew Mellon. Now, you may not have heard of Andy Mellon, but as a nation, we owe him a great debt, while at the same time, we should all be spitting on his grave. I always like to talk about how virtually nobody is ever all bad or all good. We all have both of those little cartoon angels and devils on our shoulders, and Andy Boy Mellon is a prime example. Let me detour here to say that I love art. It's very important to me. Art is, of course, completely subjective. As a personal aside, I will tell you that, by and large, I can't give two shits for 95% of what is termed modern art. I probably like Kandinsky better than Pollock, but for me, that's the same as saying I prefer banging my elbow on the doorframe more than banging my shin on the coffee table. The last group that I can say I really love may be Edward Hopper and his contemporaries, and I will readily admit that I like Hopper's Automat much better than his Nighthawks. So we're talking work that's 90-plus years old there. Not that anybody gives a rat's ass, but my favorite painter is probably John Singer Sargent. I love way more than half of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Caravaggio was amazing. Canaletto was a freaking genius with his brilliant little white accents. And Mexican retablos are pretty stinking cool. But back to Andrew Mellon. Mellon was a Pittsburgh dude who started working in his father's bank. This was back when banks were owned by people, not corporations, though damned if the Supreme Court can tell a difference. Mellon was described by his most recent biographer as being without empathy, quote, devoted to making money, end quote, and, quote, against idleness, end quote. The first two seem spot on, but the last one, well, he did take a very business-like approach to collecting art. Whether he ever sat down to enjoy it, who knows. Look at pictures of Andrew Mellon, and he is very much like a consumptive Mr. Potter. And you're a warped, frustrated young man. Mellon was a conservative Republican, back when that had everything to do with business and very little to do with vaginas and the Bible. He was adamantly against debt and taxes. Adamantly. Through his bank, he backed and thus profited greatly from companies such as Westinghouse, Alcoa, Gulf Oil, New York Shipbuilding, and Old Overholt Whiskey. He also funded Kennywood Amusement Park because it was at the end of the streetcar line that his family owned. In 1921, when he was one of the 2 or 3 richest men in America, the new president, Warren Harding, talked Andy Mellon into becoming Secretary of the Treasury. He stayed there for 3 presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. He left the progressive income tax in place, but he came up with proposals that were trickle-down economics just without the stupid-ass name. He convinced Harding and Coolidge that cutting tax rates for top earners would bring in more tax revenue. He kept pushing for lower interest rates, more borrowing, he was a banker after all, and more stock market investment. He was especially foaming at the mouth against the inheritance tax, because that one would take away from the hundreds of millions he was due to get from his daddy. And yes, that whole ball of wax is just as pitifully and criminally stupid and transparent in the 1920s as it is today. What it does is create a wider income gap between people like Mellon and everybody else, and people like Mellon could not care less. This walking cadaver even arranged through policy a series of corporate income tax rebates that put $400K in his personal pocket and millions into the pockets of 40 companies he either owned or was affiliated with. In short, everyone could see that Andrew Mellon was robbing the American treasury of income while he ran it, and diverting the money into his own accounts. Just as has happened repeatedly with tax cuts for the rich and trickle-down, the middle and lower classes get hurt. The rich keep getting richer, and the bubble that made them that money, whatever it is, goes pop. In 1929, that pop was the stock market, and it brought on the Great Depression. What separated the Great Depression from things like the Bush recession or the Orange Goon recession was Andrew Mellon. He convinced Herbert Hoover that direct government intervention in the economy was evil and wrong. Instead, he wanted asset liquidation, and he had no problem with raising tariffs to one of the highest levels in U.S. history. All of that policy put more people out of work. Mellon didn't think all that unemployment, which was over 20% by 1931, was catastrophic. According to Herbert Hoover's memoirs, Mellon said, quote, "Enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people," end quote. Andrew Mellon became so hated that Congress tried to impeach him as Treasury Secretary, and Hoover switched him over to being ambassador to Great Britain. Oh yeah, he was also underneath a huge federal tax-dodging investigation at the time. Henry Clay Frick, who was coming up in a little bit, encouraged Mellon to start collecting art, and at the same time that he was running the nation's workforce into the ground, Mellon had also compiled one of the best art collections in D.C. He started with British masters, Gainsborough and Reynolds. When Mellon was U.S. ambassador in London, he was touring Europe and buying other art. Lots of Dutch paintings. It became a compulsion. Mellon was even buying masterpieces from the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1930 and 1931. fine art museums filled with paintings financed by the Medicis were apparently not so high on the Soviet agenda, I suppose. So the Pinko Kami Ruskies sold a boatload of paintings to Andy Mellon, Botticelli, Franz Hals, Titian, Van Dyck, Raphael, Rembrandt. Dozens of the world's masterworks came home to the U.S. without Mellon being shot and buried in a Polish forest. Stalin liked money too. Once he was out of work in politics and still facing the tax case, Mellon went to FDR, the new president, in 1936 and pitched the idea for a National Gallery of Art, patterned after the one in London. He was going to donate a bunch of his best art, 120 paintings and 21 sculptures, plus a truckload of money, with the stipulation being that there was a board of trustees and Mellon got to pick most of them. Done deal. That's how we got a National Art Museum. It was thanks to Andrew Mellon. Mellon, by the way, also paid a tidy sum to settle his tax case with the IRS. So was our National Gallery of Art created out of calculated atonement? Who's to say? Now, not all big art donors also ruined the country's entire economy and made people starve to death by the hundreds of thousands, of course. The people responsible for bringing us incredible art museums are a totally mixed bag. Some are really great and admirable people, and then there's the other ones. And we are fixin' to name names. This is where, real news shows would have some little stinger music, but yeah, I don't have that. Art museums do buy shit, of course. They send people to auctions, they dispatch operatives to crash high-end cocktail parties, they meet in dark alleys at night. Where's the Kaibot? I need to see the money first. For all I know, there's some paintings for sex scandal out there just waiting to be exposed. But mostly, museums get donations from really rich people who have amassed a vast personal art collection and will it to the hometown museum, or start parceling some of it out even before they're in the ground. Surprisingly, one of the poorer cities for this behavior is Los Angeles. There are some incredible private art collections among the movie producers, and yeah, some performers like Leo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Doogie Howser, Madonna, Jay-Z, and Elton John have expensive art collections. The biggest are owned by producers. Surprise, surprise. Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael Ovitz, huge art collectors for decades. David Geffen, another DreamWorks founder, has a smaller collection number-wise than many of them, but he buys super high-end works that he loves. The highest estimates are that Geffen's art collection is worth $2.3 billion. Probably only worth about $2 billion, though, so Either way, thank you to everyone who saw Kung Fu Panda 6 or more times. Geffen is currently rated as having the most valuable private art collection in the world. Well, all these LA collections are owned by people still alive, so we don't get to see them. Fortunately for Americans, there were a shit ton of old industrialists across the country who also loved art and then died. Because of them, in the older cities, we have some freaking amazing museums. The whole art museum thing is pretty damn new to the United States, by the way. The oldest public art museum we have is the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum, which opened in 1844, less than 200 years ago. It's in Hartford, Connecticut. The founder, not surprisingly, was a dude named Wadsworth. But he was not some sketchy megalomaniac business type. That was his dad, Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a sea captain and merchant who became quite the muckety in Connecticut, and made boatloads of money being a sea captain and all, supplying things like kettles and pork to the Continental Army during the American Revolution, all while taking a huge profit. So, the Wadsworth fortune was made by skimming off the very founding of our nation. Daniel, the son, was an amateur painter himself, but he used his money to be a patron to other better artists. Now, seeing as how they were artists, they may have all been laying around in untied bathrobes hitting the bong all day. But he sponsored Frederick Church and Thomas Cole, and he married a niece of John Trumbull, one of the big Revolutionary-era artists. And not long before he kicked the great paint bucket in the sky, Wadsworth set up this museum in his hometown of Hartford. One of the wings in the Wadsworth Museum was paid for by J.P. Morgan, the financier behind all the robber barons and the direct through line today to Chase Bank. He was one of the more power-hungry oligarchs we have ever had in the history of the United States, probably top of the list. Morgan, Mellon, Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller were the first billionaires in U.S. history, and they exercised even more power in the absence of regulation than billionaires do today. For our purposes, though, let's just talk about his connection to art. Morgan's name is attached to the Morgan Library, so you might think that he was this huge collector of rare books and manuscripts, and he was. The Morgan Library is a great place that I have never visited, and I really want to go, but that's not the biggest legacy, really. Morgan's name is not on an art museum, but he was the president and Banana Republic dictator of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He had big cigars and nubile girls with palm fronds and everything. Morgan was the first fashizzle at the Met. Morgan's legacy with the Met is kind of lost today because there have been so many huge donors there, but he should really be top of the list. He had so much power, he steered the entire institutional collecting plan for a decade. Morgan decided he would start collecting art kind of late in his life, but in about 23 years, he amassed roughly 20,000 objects into his collection. Morgan had so much money, he did stuff that only Bourbon kings and Romanov czars had been able to do before. He bought entire collections at a time: Egyptian, Islamic, Byzantine, Roman, Asian. He loved religious artifacts, and he bought altarpieces painted by Raphael. He had paintings by Vermeer and other Dutch masters. When Morgan died, his son Jack became the sole heir to this incredible collection. Jack gave 7,000 rare artworks to the Met, but the Met was pissed because they expected all of it. It was like finding out Daddy had a mistress at the reading of the will. Jack Morgan, though, spread them around. About 1,300 went to the Morgan wing at the Wadsworth. Jack also thought the estate needed some cash, so he sold off a bunch of stuff for liquidity. Some of the folks who bought from Morgan's collection ended up later putting them into the National Gallery. Henry Clay Frick bought a ton of it. I mentioned a little bit ago that Frick was great friends with Andy Mellon. They were poker buddies, and they actually owned Old Overholt Whiskey Company together, which you gotta kind of admire, it's whiskey. When Frick died, he left his part of the distillery to Mellon, who kept it until Prohibition. As far as the art collections, Frick, with his imaginary friend Frack, had his own museum. He built a $5 million house on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan with the plan from the get-go that it would be turned into an art museum. He designed it with that in mind. He even left a cool $15 million for future conservation of the collection. And it is a pretty impressive amalgamation of art. Bunches of major works by Bellini, Corot, Van Dyck, Fragonard, Gainsborough, Constable, Rembrandt, Reynolds, Turner. There are sculptures and furniture and clocks and ceramics. It shows a huge dedication on the part of Henry Clay Frick. If you haven't listened to episode 2 that I did on U.S. labor, then please do. One of the most famous physical attacks on American workers was at Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1892. It was the Carnegie Steel Company, which in June of that year slashed wages, kicked workers out of their company housing, refused to negotiate, and then brought in Pinkertons, who were the Wagner group of the day, to attack the workers who had by then gone on strike. 3 Pinkertons and 7 strikers were killed in the battle, and the dude behind that bloodshed was Henry Clay Frick, who was chairman of Carnegie Steel. Frick was such a hard-nosed robber baron dickweed that an anarchist and author named Sacha Berkman, a guy who was playing Hide the Manifesto with Emma Goldman, talked his way into Frick's office and tried to kill him. He pointed a gun at Frick's head and fired, hitting him in the shoulder, which tells you either Berkman was a shitty shot or Frick had one big-ass office. A few years later, while Berkman was locked up in the pokey, Frick and Carnegie turned on each other. Ultimately, Carnegie sold his interest in the steel company to J.P. Morgan, who used it to create U.S. Steel. And Morgan hired Frick to be that company's chairman. If by now you're screaming into the ether that this whole rich people's art thing is like the ultimate let them eat cake, sire, the peasants are revolting, you said it, they stink on ice. You're right. And if these art treasures were all still behind US-made steel doors, we could leave the subject right there. But they're not. The rich folks up at the big house who made it to this story have largely chosen at some point in their lives or deaths to share this beauty with us commoners. Part of the whole impetus, a really big part, behind the start of American art collecting and starting all of these museums in the late 1800s was that we little Americans felt culturally inferior to Europe, which of course we are. On the other hand, we had a bunch of very wealthy people, so they did the patriotic thing and bought a bunch of art in Europe and brought it back to the U.S. And then they charged those cheese and garlic-eating bastards $20 a pop to buy note cards and refrigerator magnets of their old paintings. Or they would once William Perry of Chicago got around to inventing the refrigerator. In other words, Americans started building art museums to compensate. Only a handful of these rich collectors decided to start their own museums. I mentioned Frick, but also Isabella Stewart Gardner is an interesting story. Now, not a shocker, but she was born rich and married richer. Neither she nor the hubby, Jack, were particularly good looking. But Isabella was interested in a lot of things. She started by collecting rare books and manuscripts. Think gorgeous early hand-drawn editions of Dante's Divine Comedy. Jack and Isabella started hanging out in Venice, and she became pals with John Singer Sargent, James McNeill Whistler, and Ralph Curtis. Not surprisingly, she bought a bunch of their paintings. But she also patterned her personal museum after the Venetian palazzo where she'd been staying. A place owned by her friends, by the way. And let me just say, I don't have a lot of friends that I can just call up and say, "Hey man, y'all have a cool house. I want to come stay in your guest room for 3 years. By the way, try not to make a lot of noise early in the morning, and I'm going to need almond milk for my Count Chocula." Isabella hired an art advisor and sent him out to Europe to buy shit. Among other things was a Rembrandt self-portrait, a Vermeer, which she picked up for $6,000, and a Titian, which she spent then a record £20,000 on. Jack died of a stroke, possibly when he heard how much his wife had been blowing on art. But Isabella continued with their plans to build a museum, and like I said, she had it designed to be a Venetian palace except in Boston. It has about 7,500 paintings and 3,000 rare books. The thing you might know about Isabella Gardner's museum is that in 1990, it was the scene of what is still the largest property theft in the history of the world, not counting like the heist of the entire Americas, mind you. 2 thieves, disguised as cops, tied up the guards and stole 13 artworks with heavy emphasis on Rembrandt and Degas, plus a Manet and a Vermeer. They cut the paintings out of their frames, made 2 trips down to the car, probably stopped off to eat some of those shit donuts from Dunkin'. The art is still missing. The frames have been left on the wall empty for coming up on 35 years, and the museum is still offering a $10 million reward. Most of these rich collectors, though, did not go the route of Gardner and Frick. They gave their art and a little of their money to hometown museums. Some of the oldest cities that you or the Orange Goon may have considered total shitholes today have impeccable under-the-radar art museums, and it's all thanks to those people who made a pile of cash back when those cities were in their prime. Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit, in particular, were the butt of jokes for decades. They shouldn't be, because they are all very cool cities, and part of what makes them great are to visit their really good art museums. The Detroit Institute of Art started as the Detroit Museum of Art, and it was an early one, opened in 1885, and one of the biggest donors of art was James Scripps, who got rich in the newspaper business, starting with the Detroit News, where he instructed his reporters to, quote, "write like people talk," end quote. The competitors called the news reporters pirates, but the people ate that shit up and they bought the Detroit News. Scripps and his brother George were half-brothers to E.W. Scripps, who owned a paper in Cincinnati and started Scripps Howard Newspapers and Scripps Media, which is what the insiders in that business call a big-ass deal. James Scripps went on a tour of Europe, buying paintings, and he gave them all to this nascent museum in his hometown. He dropped 75 large on an Italian Madonna and Child. A painting, that is, not a real Madonna and Child. He bought a long list of Dutch and Byzantine art, and especially Italians, including a Michelangelo drawing, a piece attributed to Da Vinci, and multiple works by Titian, Correggio, and Annibale Carracci. Though he looked like one of the dudes from the Smith Brothers cough drops, James Scripps knew his art, and he gave it all to the Detroit Museum. Once they started getting a bunch of auto industry money, they got all modern and shit. The Detroit Institute of Art was the first American museum to acquire a Van Gogh. The money behind the Buffalo Museum was John Albright, who made his money in coal and steel and thwarting workers' rights. But the art dude was Seymour Knox, which sounds more than vaguely suggestive. Knox liked modernists, and he donated the first important pieces to the Buffalo Museum: Cézanne, Paul Klee, Modigliani, Miro, Matisse, Picasso. Knox is one of those rare big art collectors who had an actual job working for someone else. I mean, he was hardly a lunch bucket regular Joe looking to trade a pickle for a deviled egg, but he was a director of Woolworths and American Steamship and Marine Midland Bank. In the 1920s, that brought in enough coin to keep a fellow in Picasso's. Texas oil money turned out some very nice art and a few museums. In Houston, that includes the Blaffer, who was one of the founders of Exxon, and especially the Menil, where the money comes from Schlumberger. French oil money relocated to Texas and sunk into a world-class collection of African art, plus Oceania, and an entire Byzantine chapel. For good measure, the Menils also bought a Marthe Rothko chapel and dedicated it to human rights. In Austin, it was Jack Blanton who was into art. He got his start with Eddie Skurlock, who was one of the big boot-wearing, Cadillac-driving wildcatters. My favorite Texas art museum is in Fort Worth, and it was started by Amon Carter, who was in the newspaper business. He got his actual start in business selling chicken sandwiches to people waiting for the train, though the chicken was more likely rabbit that he and his buddies plinked with a .22. Carter started the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and then he got into radio really early, and he had the first TV station in Texas. He was a major string puller with FDR and others, and is largely responsible for getting the money to start Texas Tech University. He was all Fort Worth, and he hated Dallas so much that every time he had to go over there for a meeting, he took a sack lunch so he didn't contribute any money to the Dallas economy. Amon Carter also loved Western art. He had a collection of 400 paintings, sculptures, and drawings by Frederick Remington and Charles Russell, and that became the core of the Amon Carter Museum of Western Art. Next time you need to see a magnificent oil painting of a buffalo hunt, that's your best bet. You'll find the same kind of story is true at the great museums in Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia and a bunch of smaller places. All of them have a buttload of donors, some of whom made their money in ways you just might not like, and a few of them who were downright scoundrels and crooks. And as you will learn coming up, a handful fall into the category of despicable ass nozzle. First, I want to go back to the National Gallery for a second, because I dearly love that place. It's one of the myriad of reasons we should take enormous pride in our American government. The National Gallery belongs to us, and it is open to us, free of charge, 363 days a year, one extra in leap years. In spite of me spending all of that time on Andy Mellon up top, there were bunches of other early donors of art collections to the National Gallery, and they deserve a word of thanks and or a partial raking over the coals. There are way too many to list, but Samuel Kress started a chain of 5 and dime stores in Memphis, and they grew nationwide. He appreciated architecture enough to hire a guy full-time to design the outside of his stores, and some of them are still around and wicked cool. He and his brother Rush also liked art, and compiled a personal collection of Renaissance masterpieces and allegorical religious paintings and other beauties over 30 years. It has been called, quote, the world's most encyclopedic collection of Italian paintings, end quote. And then Kress decided to give it all away. They donated 25% of their art to the National Gallery and the remainder to 40 other museums. Then Kress set up a foundation to continue giving away a few $1,000,000 a year in the name of art. Their donation to the National Gallery was actually bigger than Mellon's. One little interesting story about the Kress brothers: they had a famous painting of the Nativity, and in the late 1930s, when it was still their private painting, they hung it in one of the Kress store windows in New York City so the public could see it at Christmas time. So yeah, Next to the mannequins wearing feathered hats was this 15th century Italian masterpiece. The art dealer who sold it to Kress reportedly had to have his pants hosed out when he heard about it. Like the Met and most other big art museums, there were a host of famous names associated with the early National Gallery, the People's Art. The Havermeyer family, German-Americans who made a fortune in sugar refining, they have links to old money names like Frelinghuysen and Vanderbilt. Bernice Chrysler Garbisch, who was the daughter of Walter Chrysler of car and skyscraper fame, was one of the biggest collectors and benefactors of American folk art. She and her husband Edgar collected 2,600 pieces of American folk art and donated it to the National Gallery and the Met, and ultimately they set up their own Chrysler Museum. And since they lived on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay, that museum is in Norfolk, Virginia. Averell Harriman was the son of a rich railroad magnate who became governor of New York and whose name was floated for president a couple of times. More importantly, he went from being one of the top New Deal bureaucrats in FDR's administration to being ambassador to the Soviet Union to helping coordinate both Lend-Lease and the Marshall Plan. But it ain't all roses. Before World War II, Harriman's banking firm was the top connection for Nazi businessmen in the United States. Several of his assets were seized by the government. He was big in the negotiations with Stalin during the war when they were our allies, but he came to distrust and dislike the communists. He ended up getting appointed by JFK as Assistant Secretary of State for Far East Asia, an old man who was hard of hearing, but JFK loved him, and it was Harriman who thought sending American troops into Laos and then into Vietnam would strengthen the U.S. bargaining position in Asia. He was also our main guy supporting the coup against Diem. In the end, he wound up being against the war, which he had helped escalate in the first damn place. The Harrimans also had a collection with a few dozen French Impressionists as the headliners. His wife, who had been married into the Vanderbilt and Whitney families earlier, had her own art gallery for a while before World War II. He or his family donated a couple of Walt Kuhn and Andre Derain and a beautiful greenish Van Gogh painting of roses. It's something to savor when it's on display, and it may or may not make you think of the Vietnam War. Barbara Hutton was heir to a third of the Woolworth fortune. She was the tabloid fodder of her day, Patty Hearst without the machine gun and Kim Kardashian with a much smaller booty. Her father neglected her, her mother may have committed suicide, she suffered from anorexia, she boozed it up and globe-trotted, she was married and divorced 7 times, including to Cary Grant, and the press dogged her constantly. She also both inherited and amassed on her own a fantastic collection of European art. She was known to appear drunk in public and give valuable things away to virtual strangers. But she was also a large supporter of the National Gallery and gave them some breathtaking paintings of Venice, including a couple of bitchin' Canalettos. Sometimes just the trail of provenance is fascinating. Arthur Sachs, a name you might recognize from Goldman Sachs, which is the investment firm that thought Gordon Gekko was a real person, was a giant art collector, to the point that after Sachs retired and lived in France, he loaned artworks to the Louvre. Right? That sounds like Bill Gates asking to borrow a sawbuck. I mean, wow. He was also a big donor in restoring the cathedral at Chartres. Sachs had some very nice Renaissance paintings, plus a kick-ass Manet and an early Renoir painting of Claude Monet, and he sold all of those to Paul Mellon, Andy's kid, in 1961, and Mellon, in turn, ended up donating them to the National Gallery. 2 of the more interesting big early donors to the National Gallery are Lessing Rosenwald and Adele Rosenwald Levy. They were children of Julius Rosenwald, who ended up owning 25% of Sears Roebuck, and not only compiled a mountain of money, he also has one of the most interesting philanthropy records in history. Most famous are the Rosenwald schools that he paid for across the South so black children could have clean, nice school buildings to go to in the middle of the most vile segregation. Over 5,000 new schools, teacher homes, and industrial training centers were paid for by Julius Rosenwald. But several of Rosenwald's kids were both involved in Jewish organizations and in the National Gallery of Art. Lessing Rosenwald got a chemistry degree from University of Chicago and then studied more at Cornell. But he started work as a shipping clerk at Sears because, well, 20 years later, he was chairman of the board. Helps to know people, right? He started collecting high-end prints about 1920, when some of the big art collections in Europe were being sold off after World War I. The 4,300 prints he collected got donated to the National Gallery, where the curator said they were the finest print collection ever amassed in the U.S. I mean, of course, what else would he say? Thanks, I guess. Rosenwald's sister Adele donated to the National Gallery also, plus she was a huge benefactor of Jewish causes. But her biggest involvement was with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where she was an active board member. But she also gave paintings to museums in Dallas and L.A. and the Met, which was Van Gogh's Purple Iris. She gave MoMA a super important Jacob Lawrence called Migration of the Negro, and Picasso's Violin and Grapes, plus lots of Degas, Cézanne, Utrillo, Renoir, and that little Gauguin in the butler's pantry. The Rosenwalds seem to have been really good people. Okay, one more National Gallery donor, and then I swear I'll move on. But next time you're perusing the art museum someplace, y'all need to know a little bit about the wide range of people, good and bad, but mostly very mixed, who brought you the art. Frida Schiff Warburg grew up in an elite New York City banking family, and she married into more of the same. To say she and her husband supported Jewish causes is insufficient. They helped Hebrew University, the Jewish Welfare Fund, the New York Visiting Nurses Service, the Young Women's Hebrew Association, and a hospital in Jerusalem. She and her husband turned their mansion on Fifth Avenue, and that is no mansion to sneeze at, into the Jewish Museum. On the art front, she not only gave paintings to the National Gallery, but also to museums in Brooklyn, at Harvard and Princeton, the New York Public Library, and the Met, where you'll find a portrait of her by Anders Zorn. Zorn was a superbly talented Swedish artist who did portraits of Grover Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt and the official portrait of William Howard Taft. I would be remiss here if I didn't pause to offer a heartfelt jump up my ass to all the anti-Semites out there. The philanthropy in the United States, in our art museums, but also everywhere else, is disproportionately Jewish when you compare it to the percentage of the population. Those evangelicals and holy rollers, snake handlers and tongue babblers, they don't give jack shit in the way of legacies to other people. They're fucking con men, snake oil salesmen. More importantly, they're taking money from people who most need their tiny cash to buy Similac, pork skins, a case of PBR, and some Pall Malls. You can search high and low, and you are not going to find the Joel Osteen wing at an art museum. Franklin Graham, Tammy Faye Baker, Robert Schuller, nope. No art museums. My money says if any of those people have an interest in art, it's the Mapplethorpe nudes they have stuffed down behind the toilet tank. But Mike, you say, Jerry Falwell, Oral Roberts, and Bob Jones started universities. Well, yeah. For a mere $34,000 a year, you can learn family values like intolerance and divisiveness at Liberty. Bob Jones University was all white until 1970, and then blacks were admitted as long as they didn't touch the white girls. Yes, that was official university policy until the year 2000. Oral Roberts? I can never get past the send money or God'll kill me. If only that was a fundraising option for supporters of the Orange Goon. But anyway, that's a tangent. Total tangent. I wanted to throw that in there just in case you were starting to feel too good about anything. So let's get back to the people who have made our nation's incredible art museums possible. And first of all, it's still happening. There are modern megadonors still out there. Let me take a second or two to talk about the ego involved with this whole thing. For sure, these big donors believe in the mission of the art museums. They also like the idea of the unwashed hoi polloi oohing and eyeing over the painting that once hung in their half bath, where you should never use the guest towels. But there is also a lot of ego involved. I still have a nonprofit that makes documentaries about American and Texas history, and I can tell you from 20 years' experience, most people who give want to see their names on shit. Raising money for history is really hard. The credits of a movie, even though we put them first, does not hold a candle to getting your name on a building. And a huge wing of the local art museum is so much more uplifting than having your name on the hospital where Uncle Benny died of piles. Art is huge business also. It is touted now as a sure thing investment because the prices have all been going up, unlike stocks and bonds or Cabbage Patch dolls. All big collectors of high-priced art have their personal art advisors, and you may go to their house and look over their personal collections, and they gush and blab about color and composition. But you bet your ass that most of them also want to know if that $3 million they just dropped on some up-and-coming avant-garde putz of a sculptor will make a profit in 10 years if they ever need to sell it. And they do get sold. David Geffen, mentioned earlier, sold a single Jackson Pollock piece for $140 million. Presumably he was sending a kid to college. Of course, aside from that Onderdonk bluebonnet painting that turned up at Goodwill and made me scream, "Why can't that shit happen to me?" These big art collections are not going to end up in a double wide or a landfill. The best of them will eventually be donated somewhere that the paying public can see them. Other people love the art, but just give money. Arthur and Margaret Glasgow gave $70 million to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, but good Lord, is that a story. He was an engineer who built gas plants, and he and his wife died in the mid-1950s. They left the money to the art museum, but the estate wasn't settled until 2011. So for 60 fucking years, the museum has hoped the money was coming. Development officers were hired and retired and never saw that promised $70 million. Meanwhile, there was probably Cletus and Brandine, the cousins back in Botetourt County, trying to get their share. Another big recent donation, Jorge Perez, a real estate guy in the U.S. and South America, gave $30 million to the Miami Art Museum, which I like to think has an entire gallery dedicated to velvet paintings of Don Johnson. One of the seemingly coolest stories is Eli and Edith Broad. They met in college, where Eli got a CPA degree, and he moved up then from accounting to owning a construction company to buying an insurance company, which he turned into an insurance and investment company called Sun America, and then sold that to AIG for almost $18 billion. I mean, shit, that is even more than I have in change behind my couch cushions. Now, I loathe insurance companies, but damn, Jack, that's a lot of Jack. The Broads loved art, specifically modern stuff. You name a modernist from Picasso to Johns to Basquiat to Rauschenberg, they owned it. They built the Broad Museum in L.A., and they were massive supporters of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, a museum that didn't start on its own until 1961, by the way. They gave $27 million to their own Broad Foundation, which includes an average annual donation of $4.8 million to the arts. This last little part should come as no surprise. Thanks to our corrupt system, money and politics are deeply intertwined. Some of the biggest donors to art these days, just like the ones in the way back, are also some of the biggest donors to politics. Alice Walton. Now, I badmouth Walmart all the time for their horrendous record with unions and American manufacturers. But like most families, they are not a monolith. Grab a quick mental picture of your own Thanksgiving table. In 2016, Alice Walton was a big Hillary supporter. She also has a $500 million personal collection with Warhols, Norman Rockwell, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Edward Hopper. Alice started the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. It's in Arkansas, where horizons greatly need expanding. There is more to life than putting your head under the governor's skirt and yelling, "Woo, suey!" I have to mention Paul Allen, along with Bill Gates, the founders of Microsoft. He also owned the Seattle Seahawks and the Portland Trail Blazers. He got into other tech and aerospace, and he loved art. He had impeccable and varied taste. Back a decade ago, there was an exhibit in Portland of 40 paintings from Paul Allen's collection. Here's one of the write-ups, quote, "Spanning 5 centuries and belonging to European and American landscape painting, the show will include artworks by Claude Monet, Edouard Manet, Vincent van Gogh, Canaletto, Ed Ruscha, J.M.W. Turner, Gustav Klimt, David Hockney, Gerhard Richter, and many others. Paul Allen's favorite periods include Impressionism, modern and contemporary art, and old masters." End quote. Well, Paul, that's pretty much everything, and you could afford it, so good on you. That Portland show was one of 47 museums that got to borrow his art. Before he died, Paul Allen gave away $2 billion to to a wide array of causes: science, medicine, environment, education, and then he set up a foundation to keep doing philanthropy. He gave $100 million to arts organizations, and his collection was auctioned off after he died. It was the largest art auction in the history of the planet. More than $1.5 billion, with the proceeds going to, quote, undisclosed philanthropies, end quote. Sheldon Adelson made his money in casinos. He died a couple of years back, but he had been the Orange Goons' largest donor, including paying to whitewash the investigation into election interference the first time around and ponying up to Photoshop people into the inauguration crowd. Adelson also gave very heavily to Jewish causes, more than anyone, in fact. Tons of those donations were in Israel, where he was a huge sponsor of Netanyahu. Knock me over with a feather. Here's the interesting thing about Adelson's Republican giving. The policy he wanted to influence the most was U.S.-Israeli policy. He is probably the prime reason the U.S. Embassy got moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and his biggest political focus was turning the Republicans into supporters of the occupation of the West Bank and allying them with the Israeli right. On the other hand, here's a thank you where it's due. During the pandemic, Adelson supposedly made sure that none of his 55,000 casino employees got laid off. Old Shelley was also an art guy. He even tried to turn one of his Vegas casinos into an art museum, Guggenheim Vegas. It failed. What did he collect? Among other things, Adelson collected George W. Bush paintings. As long as we're in Vegas, I've got to mention Steve Wynn, the dude many say was the model for Andy Garcia in Ocean's 11. Many people are telling me that. Lots of people. Electric sharks. Only the best sharks. Steve Wynn is smart enough to not overly publicize his politics because he liked fleecing all people. But one of the art magazines said, quote, he is believed to be a Republican supporter, end quote. Well, let's just say that he got sued by the U.S. government, who alleged he was hitting the Orange Goon administration, actual name, up for favors to help his business in Macau. Wynn also resigned as CEO of his company in 2018 over sexual misconduct allegations. So now he's keeping busy with art. His collection? Well, let's start by saying that at one time, Wynn had one of only 2 Vermeers in private hands. The other belonged to Queen Elizabeth, and Steve Wynn's Vermeer was never licked by corgis. He has since sold the Vermeer. He also sold a Van Gogh and a Gauguin to a hedge fund billionaire for $120 million. But he ain't going broke, folks. He bought a Monet a few years back for $85 million, and Art News estimates his collection is worth about $1 billion smackaroonies. And I gots to include this sentence from another one of the art mags in 2016. Quote, Steve Wynn is also known in the art world for accidentally making a puncture in a $40 million Picasso painting, making a 2-inch tear. End quote. And that, children, is why you never run with scissors. The last name I'm going to throw at you in this art history tour, and you will get a transferable hour's credit, by the way, is the Koch brothers. Sorry, did you just stop your workout to spit up a little? Yeah. Charles and David Koch are/were billionaire art patrons. They share a lot in common with others on this list. They inherited a bunch of their money, and one of them's dead. Koch Industries is described as, quote, an American multinational corporation, end quote, which sounds contradictory to me. It's involved in manufacturing, trading, and investments, and politics. In 2016 alone, the year that brought us the Orange Goon and resulted in the most radical, right-wing, and corrupt court system we've had in well over a century, the Koch brothers invested $890 million in Republican campaigns. I use the word invested because in our system of bribery, even the possums in my backyard know the Kochs expected a return on their investment in the way of being allowed to destroy American families while they pocket the extra profits. Some of it is also just a true belief in setting the nation back 500 years. The Koch brothers' names are on Lincoln Center Theater and the plaza outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art. William Koch, another brother, collects Western ephemera, including the last known surviving photograph of Billy the Kid, which he bought at an auction for $2.3 million. The bottom line, or at least one of them, is that the Koch brothers have been giving something back. You'll have to judge for yourself if it comes remotely close to making up for all of the pain they've inflicted on millions by doing things like destroying the planet and making damn sure that the bulk of the American people continue to struggle economically and with suppressed dignity, all so they can pay lower taxes. Still, there are clearly people who set a much lower bar overall. Elon Musk, worth $195 billion, give or take, depending on what stupid shit he does on a given day, has a foundation. It's one run entirely at his own discretion. Now, by law, foundations have to disperse at least 5% of their assets a year. So what does Musk give to? Well, they do things like set up private schools for his employees, or give money for internet access to rural schools in countries who become customers of his satellite company. So, that arrogant tool ain't saving the animals or the environment, he's not funding medicine, and he sure as shit is not given to art museums. It's more likely he's playing pickup basketball with Joel Osteen and Franklin Graham. As to the art itself, who freaking knows what treasures are behind well-locked and alarmed private doors? And I'm not talking about the stuff that was looted from Jews before World War II, or dragged out of Egypt or Greece or Mexico or Peru. I'm just talking about people's personal collections. But if any of y'all have a few minor Monets in your kitchen, or even a nice Bert Morisot in the guest room, you can invite me over through my website, MikeVanceWriter.com. And Lord knows, if you ever get hammered and generous like Barbara Hutton, I can always find a little more wall space. So like I said up top, the history behind the art museum is all over the map, but they are grand and uplifting places to visit, and I think they're a good place to go and cool your political temperature over the next few months. Art, like sports, wildlife, music, wine, and sunsets, is enjoyed by at least some people on both sides of the aisle. Try those out as topics of conversation for a change, and go relax, because you having a stroke over the daily news ain't gonna get us anywhere. Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my website at MikeVanceWriter.com. Prick the Balloon is copyrighted by Mike Vance, all rights reserved.